Okay, chapter 23, the Great Depression. This week is a little different. Your discussion post is really easy. Don't spend too much time on it. I think I have you do 5 New Deal programs and explain what they are. I wish we had more time, but you also have a midterm exam to take in addition to the chapter 23 weekly quiz, and that quiz is only 13 questions. I shortened it for you because I'm trying to ease your burden this week, because you do have that midterm exam, which is 50 questions, 2 points each, worth 100 points. So that is going to be your focus this week, which means we're going to have to shortchange this guy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's typically seen as the 3rd most important president in American history. First and second is going to be Washington and Lincoln. Washington's father of the country, Lincoln saved the country. But Franklin Roosevelt, very significant. So what can I say about the Great Depression in like 9 minutes now? First of all, it is the greatest crisis that this country ever faced besides the Civil War. The Civil War almost tore this country apart. We almost became many different countries, and it did tear the country apart, 750,000 killed. Well, the Great Depression threatened to do the same thing. Because of the worldwide global depression, governments were toppling all over the world. And we saw Germany fall, and desperate times calls for desperate measures. People felt that capitalism had failed, democracy had failed, this experiment had failed, and the Constitution wasn't going to survive this crisis, because you had at least 1/4 of all Americans that were out of work. Even during the height of the pandemic and COVID, you didn't approach near those numbers. And it doesn't just last for 1 year, it lasts for a decade. So it was really bad. The Great Depression begins in 1929, a stock market crash. You're hopefully a little familiar with that. But it actually, Hoover is president. He had just become president. He had only been in office like 8 months. So you can't blame him. But then it gets worse in 1930. And it gets worse in 31. And it gets worse in 32, the election year, when Hoover's up for re-election, which he'll lose badly to this guy, Franklin Roosevelt. Hoover took a laissez-faire approach to this depression. Now, that's a little mischaracterization, because he does a Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But for the most part, he felt like it was a natural cycle of things, and that the economy would come back stronger, because if the government stays out of the economy, then the businesses that failed, they weren't successful, and those that come back stronger. But we had never seen anything like this before. We had never seen economy crash so much that it brought down the whole banking industry. It was bringing down the pillars of our economy, and thereby the pillars of our government. Because if the economy crashes, the next thing to go is the political system, because then people are going to resort to desperate measures, like in Germany, as they did at the time. And so this is a big threat. So along comes this guy, and Franklin Roosevelt would be elected 4 times, 1932, 36, 1940, and 1944. And he would be president during the Great Depression and during World War II. So he saw the country through 2 of its biggest crises in its history. And when he comes in with the Great Depression, he is not laissez-faire, and he believes that the government needs to take action. He's also not a rigid ideologue. People associate him with being this liberal, but he's really not. He is more pragmatic, more practical. Try something, see if it works. If it doesn't, try something else. And so the first thing is he introduces his New Deal program. And there's a whole bunch of alphabet soup programs. They're called alphabet soup because they include the NRA, the National Recovery Act, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Roosevelt gets past 15 major acts in the first year. Today, if a president gets one or two things, they like to claim success. Roosevelt gets 15 done in the first 100 days. That's why it's called the first 100 days. He is the most gifted politician in our history, and I mean that in that he's elected 4 times and that he gets most legislation passed. And that's because he has overwhelming majorities in Congress. They owe him their office. And so if he asks Congress to pass legislation, they pass it. Because if they don't, he won't support them in the next election. And he is wildly popular. We've never had someone this popular before that had the Roosevelt Coalition or the New Deal Coalition. And that was voters of diverse backgrounds, and they all support him. People in the South, Democrats. Of course, the South is predominantly Democrats at this time because Lincoln was a Republican. Everything's flipped now. But they supported Franklin Roosevelt. And African Americans in the North supported Franklin Roosevelt. Very diverse groups supported him. And because he is such a gifted politician. And one of the reasons he's such a gifted politician is because he understood the power of this device. So this is a radio. The radio is from 1923. And Roosevelt comes into office in 1933, 10 years after this radio was made, and he realizes the power of that machine. He realizes that in his fireside chats, he can sit and talk and communicate with people in a very personal way and coming to their living rooms. So much so that many people would hang a picture of Franklin Roosevelt over their radios or over their fireplaces. And so those became known as Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. And he explained things simply, and then he would get widespread popular support because he was so persuasive and so convincing in these fireside chats. This particular picture that I got, my grandfather had one like this, and my grandfather was a Reagan Republican. So that, again, shows you the diversity of Franklin Roosevelt's support. Not everyone liked him, because many people felt, as this book says, that he was a traitor to his class. And that's because he was one of the most wealthy presidents there ever was. He came from old money and from old wealth. But he believed in taxing the rich in order to help benefit the poor. And so his programs often benefited the poor, but the wealthy people really despised him, even though he's one of them. That's why he is called sometimes traitor to his class. Think about the significance of the New Deal programs, all the things we still live with today. Do you have a Social Security number? Franklin Roosevelt, Social Security, the whole program, those programs are wildly popular today. And they're socialist because it's a redistribution of wealth. Why? It's to make sure, because without those, the people most hurt by the Great Depression are those who can't work, the very young and the very old, and they have no means. There was nothing at the time for them to live off of. Now, Social Security isn't really enough to live off of, but it's what we call a safety net. And it's meant to provide a safety net for those who don't have a retirement, for those who don't have nothing, for those who maybe they've had big loss in their life and they weren't able to save. At least they have something for them to fall back on. And so that Social Security is really, really popular. It's funny because the quickest way to get voted out of office is talk about touching Social Security. But it is a socialist program, as are many of the New Deal programs. But they're still with us today. And what those programs do is they help to correct the abuses of laissez-faire capitalism, of capitalism run amok. Things like minimum wage as well. So many of the government programs that he had introduced is still with us today. Now, it's an amazing time. I'm sorry we didn't get to spend more time on it. I hope you'll learn a lot from just reading the chapter. And we'll see you next week, because the Great Depression is leading to World War II, because in other countries, their governments are failing and they're turning to dictators who will start World War II. That's next week.